Hey everybody, it's John from Real Talk. Thanks for tuning in today. Today we're going to discuss a situation that some of you may have found yourself in, either as professional support staff or as a family member or a friend of somebody with diverse abilities. And you think that their lives would get better if they had more information or support around dating, love, relationships, sex, sexuality. Maybe it would make it more likely that they find a girlfriend or a boyfriend or a partner if that's something that they want in their life. Or maybe you think that they would stop running into the same difficult or dangerous situations if they had more information or support around dating, love, relationships, sex, sexuality. So that's your opinion. But there's other people in the support team who have different ideas. Maybe it's another staff member, maybe it's another family member, and they just don't think that it would be relevant or appropriate or safe for this person to have any kind of support or information about relationships, sex, sexuality. So you'd like to go ahead and provide the support, but you'd really prefer it if everybody on the team was on the same page and everybody agreed that this would be a good idea and an appropriate kind of support for this person.
As we go through this series, we'll be making reference to the Real Talk website from time to time. You can reach it at real-talk.org. There's lots of videos there, lots of resources, lots of information, so maybe just open it in another window and be prepared to click over to that window from time to time as we go through this. So today, we're going to be discussing some reasons we may have heard over the years why maybe it's a bad idea to talk to folks with diverse abilities about dating, love, relationships, sex, sexuality. And we're going to talk also about some reasons why maybe it's a good idea to talk to people with diverse abilities about these things. So you can think of this maybe as a series of talking points. If you're going into a conversation with a support team, these are some reasons maybe you could put forward why it would be a good idea to provide this kind of support. But we'll start out by talking about some reasons we may hear why it's a bad idea to talk to people with diverse abilities about these things. One reason that we may hear fairly often is that if we talk to somebody about sex and sexuality, then they'll know that it's a thing in the world and they'll be interested in it and they'll maybe want to go do it. And that's going to be really complicated and cause a lot of problems. So the best idea is simply not to talk about it. If we don't ever mention that sex exists, then the person won't be curious, they won't want to go do it. It'll be better for all concerned. Seems to make sense, right? Another reason why we may hear that it's a bad idea to talk about sex and sexuality is simply that it's not polite. It's not an appropriate topic of conversation. It's bad manners to be talking about this stuff. So we'll look at this argument as well. Another reason we may hear why it's a bad idea to talk to somebody about dating, love, relationships, sex, sexuality is that they've never brought it up. They've never given any indication that it's something that they're interested in, that's something that's on their radar. So why, if it's not something they're interested in, would we ever bring it up with them? What would be our motivation for doing that? So we'll look at that argument too. And another reason we may hear why it's a bad idea to talk to somebody about sexuality, sex, relationships, is that we might wind up saying the wrong thing. We might wind up saying something that's unintentionally offensive, that maybe goes against our organization's policies and procedures, or maybe that we just know that we feel so very uncomfortable with the subject matter that we're afraid that our own discomfort is going to bleed through into this conversation and the person's going to be able to pick up on that, and we don't really want them to pick up on that discomfort. So let's dive into this first reason we may have heard why it's a bad idea to talk about sex and sexuality. And that is that if we talk to somebody about this, then they're going to be curious about it and they might want to go do it. But if we just keep quiet about it and don't tell them anything, then their curiosity won't be piqued and we won't be opening that can of worms. On the surface, this argument actually seems like it makes a lot of sense, and it often is coming from a place of deep caring for somebody. The whole world of sex and sexuality and dating can be risky. It can bring about emotional hurt, it can bring about physical hurt sometimes, and so they would really just prefer to spare this person all of that headache and potential for rejection and heartbreak and all of that. And so they feel that maybe if we just withhold the information, then we're going to be saving the person a world of hurt. And I'm really sympathetic to wanting to save somebody a world of hurt. But unfortunately, this argument doesn't really stand up for a couple of reasons, which we're going to go into. The first reason is, even if we are withholding information about sex and sexuality from this person, the chances are good that they are learning about it somewhere. And we're going to go into this in a little bit more detail later in this section. The next place where this argument breaks down is in the idea that if we don't talk to somebody about sex, then they won't know about it and they won't want to do it. Now, it's true, if we don't talk to somebody about sex, they may not know much about it. But the chances are good that if their bodies have gone through puberty, then their bodies are going to want to do something. Our bodies are designed to respond to sexual stimulus, whether that is touch or whether it is visual images that we find exciting. And not talking to somebody about sex isn't going to change that fact. Now, another reason why this argument is kind of misguided is that the statistics show that talking to somebody about sex actually doesn't make it more likely that they're going to want to go and have sex. And we're going to dive into that again a little bit more later in this section. But the last reason why I can't really feel very comfortable with this argument comes from a place of advocacy. And that is that people have the right to know about their bodies. People have the right to know how their bodies function. People have the right to know why they may be feeling certain things. And denying people access to this information is actually a violation of their human rights. Now, another reason we may have heard why it's a bad idea to talk to somebody about sex and sexuality is that it's impolite, it's inappropriate, it's bad manners. And I think this argument actually has a little bit of validity. If we are talking about sex and sexuality, maybe for the first time, with somebody, even if we're going to be very open and frank and honest with them about the information that we're giving them, it's also important for them to know that this information, while not shameful or bad, is not the kind of information that we would discuss in a public place, like on a public transit bus or in a day program. This is more sensitive information that people tend to discuss in private. It's not shameful, it's just private. And we wouldn't want to be discussing it in public places because it might make other people feel uncomfortable. But to simply say that we mustn't talk about sex and sexuality because it's impolite, I think is wrong-headed, and there's a couple of reasons why. I think the first reason is because what that essentially means is that we are deciding on behalf of this other person what is appropriate information for them to have and what is not appropriate information for them to have. And as I mentioned at the end of that last segment, that's actually starting to violate their human rights somewhat. But another reason why I think this argument breaks down is that for a lot of folks, we are already supporting them around lots of personal care things, such as toileting or changing sanitary pads, that aren't generally considered polite subjects either. But we go in and we deal with them in a frank and straightforward way because we know that even though it's not a polite subject, that it's important for a person's health to have good care around toileting. And in the same way, even though sexuality may not be a polite subject, it can be important for somebody's physical well-being, emotional well-being, mental well-being to have information about sexuality. So even though it's not a polite topic, sometimes it is appropriate to go in and provide support around it. And in the same way that we can let a person know, yes, I'm going to provide you with support around toileting, but that doesn't mean that we're going to talk about toileting when we're out on the bus later. We can draw those distinctions that, yes, we're going to talk a little bit about sexuality right now, but that doesn't mean that it's a good idea to go and talk about sexuality when we're on the transit bus later. Another argument we may hear about why it's a bad idea to talk to somebody about dating, love, relationships, sex, sexuality, is that they've never asked us about it. It's never seemed to be something on their radar. It's never seemed to be something that they're particularly interested in. So given that it's such a personal subject, why would we bring it up with somebody if they haven't expressed interest? And to some extent, I agree with this. If we ask somebody, hey, do you want to talk a bit about sex and sexuality and learn a bit about that? And they say to us, I don't want to talk about that with you. Well, then that's fair. That's a boundary. And unless there's a really compelling reason why we need to talk about it, like some problems are happening or there's some really serious safety issues, if somebody says to us, I don't want to talk to you about this, then we should respect that boundary. But it doesn't necessarily follow from that just because somebody isn't asking us about it or talking about it, that they're not interested in it. Now, there are a number of reasons why somebody we're supporting might be interested in dating, love, relationships, sexuality, but not talking to us about it. The first reason is that they might not think that it's something that is appropriate or even possible for somebody like them. We do know that sometimes folks with diverse abilities do find loving romantic relationships and sexual relationships and sometimes marriages, but we see very, very few examples of this in any kind of media. We don't see it in television, we don't see it in films, and unless the person has somebody in their immediate circle who is also somebody with diverse abilities who does have a relationship, then they may see no examples anywhere in their life of somebody like them having a romantic relationship. And they might conclude from that it's just not something that's possible for them, or it's just not something that is appropriate for them. They might be interested in finding a partner, they might desperately want to find a partner, but they may have concluded that it's just not possible for folks like them. In a situation like that, they might not bring it up because it's really sad for them. They might not bring it up because they're afraid that they might get confirmation that no, that's not for you. Another reason why a person might be interested in dating, love, relationships, sex, sexuality, but not talking about it, is because they might have tried to talk about it in the past and got into trouble. It's very common in our culture to be deeply uncomfortable with discussing sex and sexuality. And that's fine. We have all grown up in the contexts that we've grown up in. We've all had the life experiences that we've had. And it's not reasonable for us to expect that everyone should be able to feel comfortable discussing sex and sexuality. So if it's the case that this person has had someone in their care network who is deeply uncomfortable discussing sex and sexuality, and this person has tried to bring up this subject in the past, they may have been told it's wrong, it's dirty, it's inappropriate, don't you say such things, it's private, it's personal. So they may feel that sex and sexuality is something that a person can be interested in and curious about, but it's not something a person can ever ask about or talk about. Another reason why it might be a good idea to discuss dating, sex, sexuality with a person, even if they haven't brought it up with us, is because it's part of our role as a support network to introduce a person to new ideas and new experiences. We're comfortable with the idea that really good support could include encouraging somebody to travel to a new place, or to try a new sport, or to try a new kind of food, or to try to pick up a new kind of skill, or to try out a new job. We recognize that all of these experiences have complications, they have risks, there may be particular considerations that we have to think about when we're introducing these things, but in the interest of a good life, a life that's well-rounded, a life that's rich in experience, we recognize that it is our responsibility as a care network to introduce these things. In the same way, under certain circumstances, it can be a good part of care to introduce the idea of relationships or dating. To ask a person, hey, have you ever thought about having a girlfriend or a boyfriend or a partner? Is this something that you've ever been interested in? And we know that even though this could bring up a whole bunch of complication and maybe even potential risk for an individual, introducing people to parts of the human experience that they might not have thought of before or had experience with before is actually part of our role as good care providers. Now, another argument we may hear about why it's a bad idea to talk to somebody we're supporting about dating, love, relationships, sex, sexuality is that we might say the wrong thing. Sometimes we are worried that if we say the wrong thing, we're going to get fired, so the best thing is just not to say anything. Now that's a fair worry. I think our organizations that employ us owe it to us to let us know specifically what are their policies and procedures around supporting sex and sexuality. And I would encourage people, if you want to become an advocate in this area, go and do a little bit of research into your organization's policies around supporting sexuality, romance, dating, etc. You might be surprised at what they say. It's also possible that your organization doesn't have explicit language in their policies and procedures about supporting dating, love, relationships, romance, etc. And that's not an ideal situation. However, just about every organization in BC that supports people with diverse abilities publicly affirms their support of the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And one of the things that this convention says is that people with diverse abilities have the right to information about contraception, family planning, safer sex, just like everybody else does. So even if your organization doesn't have explicit language on what their policies and procedures and expectations are of staff around supporting folks with sexuality, the chances are good that they support this United Nations Convention, which explicitly makes references to people's rights in this area. Another thing that people often fear is that if they get asked a question about sex and sexuality, they might give the wrong information. They might not know what the right answer is. And actually, if a person you support asks you a question about sex and sexuality and you don't know what the right answer is, that is in fact a great opportunity for you and this person to seek out the answer to their question together. It could involve, say, phoning a hotline, or emailing a question to a sexual health information service, or visiting a website, or watching a YouTube video from a sex educator. And if you look on the Real Talk website, we have a list of all sorts of different resources where people can get information about sexual health. And these different resources are taking into account the fact that some people like to type, some people can't type super well, some people like to talk on the phone, some people don't like to talk on the phone. So we've listed a bunch of different places where people can get sexual health information that might be best suited to their particular learning style. So I would encourage people either to pause this video now or to wait till the end and to check out the Real Talk website. Check out some of the resources there, click through to some of the links, and see if some of these resources would be appropriate for the learning styles of some of the folks that you support. So if it ever happens that a person asks you a question about sex and sexuality and you simply do not know the answer, look at it as an opportunity for the two of you to find the answer together. Not only will you get them good quality information, but you may have found them a way that they can continue to get this information on their own independently down the road without needing support from you. Another concern people have is that they might get asked a question about sex and sexuality, and it's a values-based question, and they may have an opinion about what the best answer is or what the right answer is, but it is an opinion, and other people have different opinions, and there's no right scientific answer. It's more a question of values, ethics, morals. And they wonder, is it okay for me to answer this kind of question? And we're going to dive into this a little bit more in subsequent sections of this series. But for now, let me just say that if somebody asks you a question about sex that has a values-based or opinion-based answer, a good way that you can answer that question is to say, well, my opinion is this, and then give your opinion. But then you can also say, but other people think this, and give maybe a contrary opinion. And then turn the question back around to the person who asked it to you. What do you think? What's your opinion? Another way in which people are afraid they're going to say the wrong thing is that they may simply know that they are deeply uncomfortable with the subject of sex and sexuality. And they know that any attempt they make to answer a question about sex and sexuality is going to convey that discomfort. And it might send a message to the person asking the question that this is a bad, shameful thing that people shouldn't be talking about. And they don't want to send that message to the person, so they really don't want to have to try to answer questions about sex because they know that they get so uncomfortable. Now, this is a great example of somebody knowing what their boundaries are. And I think it's really worthwhile for us to understand our boundaries and respect our boundaries. If we feel that we're just not capable or not comfortable to have any kind of conversation about sex and sexuality, that is a good reason for us not to talk about it with a person. But it's not a good reason for that person to never get access to that information. So if you feel that you are just simply too uncomfortable to talk about sex and sexuality, just direct them to somebody who you feel can give them good, worthwhile information. Maybe it's somebody else in their support team, maybe it's a hotline that they can call, maybe it's another resource like that. But just don't make your discomfort be the reason why they can't get the information that they need. So these are some of the most common arguments against providing support and information on dating, love, relationships, sex, sexuality that we might hear. And some reframing of those ideas that maybe will get people thinking a little bit differently. Now let's examine some really good reasons why it's a good idea to provide people with diverse abilities with information and support around dating, love, relationships, sex, sexuality. For one thing, sexuality happens whether we talk about it or not. For another thing, sex education happens whether we participate in it or not. Another reason is that people who have information and support around sexuality, they make better choices. And lastly, and this is one that's probably going to get the most traction, is that people who have open communication and conversation about sex and sexuality are safer. So let's dive into these ideas. First of all, sexuality happens, whether we talk about it or not. Oftentimes we hear that we don't want to talk about sexuality because then people are going to go and have sex. But even a person who's never ever going to have sex in their life needs to have some information about sexuality, and there's a reason for that. That reason is there's a difference between sex and sexuality. Simply put, sex is more about what people do. It's about activities that people take part in, either on their own during masturbation or with partners. So sex is about what we do. But sexuality is about what we are. It includes things like who do we find attractive, who do we not find attractive, how do we experience our sexual orientation. It also includes things like how do we experience our gender. It includes things like what kind of physical touch do we enjoy, what kind of physical touch do we not enjoy. It has to do with things like what kind of visual stimulus do we find exciting, what kind of visual stimulus do we find repulsive. It also has to do with how others see us and treat us. Are we the sort of person that people assume doesn't have sex? Are we the sort of person that often gets objectified in the media? So all of these things are going to contribute to a person's sexuality. And every person's experience of their own sexuality may bring about joy, it may bring about sadness, it may bring about pleasure, it may bring about trauma, it may bring about connection, it may bring about feelings of isolation and shame. It's usually a combination of things, frankly. And every single person, even a person who will never have sex in their life, has a sexuality. That's not up for debate. The only thing that's up for debate is whether or not we are going to provide a person support around this experience of sexuality, or whether we're going to say, it's not appropriate for us to talk about this, you have to figure it out all by yourself. Now sometimes we may hear an opinion expressed like, I don't think it's appropriate for this person to get any sex education. But the fact is that sex education is occurring all the time whether we choose to participate in it or not. Anyone who's ever walked past a Calvin Klein underwear ad on a billboard is getting sex education. Anybody who's ever watched a video on Much Music is getting sex education. Anyone who's ever watched a romantic comedy movie is getting sex education. Anybody who's ever watched a sitcom is getting sex education. What kind of sex education are they getting? They're getting an education on how people should conduct romantic and sexual relationships. They're getting an education on how people should signal to another person that they're romantically interested in them. They're getting an education on what kind of people are considered sexually attractive and what kind of people are considered sexually repulsive. They're getting an education on gender roles and gender stereotypes and how we're supposed to live up to them. They're getting an education on sexual objectification. What kinds of people are sexually objectified? What kinds of people do the sexual objectification? So again, the debate is not about whether or not a person should get sex education. If they're experiencing pop culture, they're getting sex education. The only question that's up for debate is, do we want to add our own voices to this education? Do we want to provide some support and some guidance around our values, about watching this stuff with a critical eye? Or do we just decide we don't want to discuss the subject and really the values and the imagery of pop culture is what's going to be defining this person's sex education? Now, another really fantastic reason why it's good to provide people with information and support around sex and sexuality is that people with access to information and support around sex and sexuality make better choices. There's an organization in British Columbia called the McCreary Foundation. And every 5 years, they do a big survey of adolescent health. Everything from diet, nutrition, drug use, to adolescent sexual health. And they've been doing this since the 1980s. And since the 1980s, teenagers keep waiting longer until they're older before first trying to have sex. Back in the 80s, teenagers were first having sex much younger than they are now. Many people are surprised to hear this statistic. They think that in our contemporary world with really hypersexualized advertising and music videos and easy access to pornography, the teenagers must be first trying out sex much younger than they did in the 80s. But in fact, the reverse is true. And one of the main factors that has led to teenagers waiting until later before first trying sex is the fact that in the 1980s, in the midst of the HIV crisis, British Columbia started providing sex education to high school students as a regular part of the curriculum. And this sex education didn't just talk about body science and anatomy and how babies were made, it also talked about sexual decision making and how to decide if you're truly ready to have a sexual experience. Now, one of the reasons why we conclude that this access to sex education has led to teenagers waiting longer before first trying sex is that in other parts of North America where they haven't had access to sex education, teenagers are first trying to have sex at the same kind of age that they were in the 1980s. So giving a person information and support around sex and sexuality doesn't make them run out and have sex. In fact, it makes it more likely that a person will choose to wait to have sex until it truly feels right for them. Finally, a really important, crucial reason why it is a good idea to talk to folks with diverse abilities about sex and sexuality is that people who have open communication and information about sex and sexuality are safer. It's not nice to think about, but folks with diverse abilities are more likely to be victims of sexual abuse. A recent study in the United States suggested that they may be up to 7 times more likely to experience sexual abuse than the general population. Now, research shows that sexual predators are looking for a couple of things in potential victims. They are looking for folks who don't know the correct names for their sexual anatomy. They're looking for folks who have a great deal of shame around sex. And most specifically, they're looking for folks who don't have anyone in their lives who they can talk to openly and honestly and unashamedly about sex. So if a sexual predator was making an advance on a person, and that person said, "Don't touch me on my vulva," that sexual predator would be running for the hills as quickly as possible. And the reason is, they would know that person knows the correct name for their sexual anatomy, and that means that somebody told them the correct name for their sexual anatomy, and that means that they have an open dialogue with somebody in their life about sex and sexuality, and that means that they are unlikely to be ashamed and afraid to bring up what just happened here with that person. So truly, one of the simplest things that we can do to make it less likely that a person who we're supporting is going to experience sexual abuse is to open up an honest, unashamed communication channel around sex and sexuality. It can make people safer, it can cut down on the amount of abuse that's occurring, and really it's on us as families, friends, and caregivers to open up that channel. So that wraps up some of the main arguments in favor of why it's a good idea for folks with diverse abilities to have information and support around sex and sexuality. If you're part of a support network, and a person in that support network feels it's a bad idea to provide this kind of support, some of these talking points might start to change their mind. They may not change a person's mind overnight. It may be a slow process of very gradually becoming somewhat more comfortable with the idea of this kind of information and support being provided. What you may be doing by bringing these arguments to the table is planting some seeds that might not bear fruit for months or even years down the road. But it can still be a really worthwhile piece of advocacy to get a care network thinking about these things and maybe changing their opinions in the long run. That's it for today. Thanks a lot for joining me. Once again, I hope that you and your families are all doing well and staying healthy and safe during this pandemic. And we hope to see you in the next couple of days with a new episode. Take care, everyone.